Good evening. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight for what promises to be a wonderful lecture and conversation. And also it's my pleasure to introduce to you my colleague, the Reverend Dr. Shanell Smith. I asked Shanell what she wanted me to say about her, and which I customarily do. And what Shanell said is, the Reverend Dr. Shanell T. Smith is first and foremost a child of God. So first and foremost, I introduce to you tonight our child of God. She's an ordained minister of Word and Sacrament in the Presbyterian Church. And Dr. Smith is also the assistant professor of New Testament and Christian Origins at Hartford Seminary, right here in Hartford, Connecticut. Shanell's scholarly interests include feminist and womanist biblical interpretation, gender and sexuality in the New Testament, and the intersections of post-colonial African American and New Testament studies, particularly, as you will see tonight, with regard to the book of Revelation. Shanell received her bachelor's degree from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey. She received a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey, and her Doctor of Philosophy from the Theological School at Drew University in Madison, New Jersey. Come on in, there's lots of seats up here, folks. Don't be shy. In Madison, New Jersey. Shanell joined our faculty in August of 2012, so she's just into her third year here, and she is already a very popular teacher. She is also a colleague who is very popular and much appreciated for her wonderful, positive spirit, her cheerful and efficient committee work, and her fine scholarship. One of the things that stands out for me when Shanell is lecturing or teaching is her remarkable gift of making clear what is complex and her ability to bring down to earth what may at first seem unduly abstract and removed. And I'm sure that is what she is going to do tonight. As you know, Shanell has just published her first book, The Woman Babylon and the Marks of Empire, reading Revelation with a post-colonial womanist hermeneutics of ambivalence. And Shanell is going to lecture about that tonight. Some of you have bought your books on the way in, and we all appreciate that. And you'll have another opportunity on the way out to buy books, and there will also be cookies and I don't know what else, tea or punch or something. So stick around and talk to each other. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Shanell Smith.
I hope I live up to that introduction. Thank you so much for being here. Good evening, everyone. Well, there are so many people that I'd like to thank, particularly in the production of this book, but it's in the acknowledgement section. But what I do want to do is give acknowledgement to my husband, Clinton, my parents, Sharon and Joy Reeves, and my cousin, Renee, who came from New Jersey. Thank you so much. I also have to thank my children who are at home, because without all the attention that they need, I'm sure this book would have taken me a lot longer. I had to get it done. But I also want to thank my colleagues at Hartford Seminary for their you can do it spirit, and for all of you here tonight that it's making me feel that my work is not in vain. So thank you so much. Dean Kim, come on. I just got up here. This book, first of all, is finished. It is a culmination of almost 4.5 years of doctoral work. And so to try to sum it up in about 30 to 35 minutes, let's just say it's going to be a challenge. But I'm going to do that for any of you scandal lovers out there. TV show. But anyway, so here's my game plan. This is just who I am. So the first thing I want to do is break down the long title. Okay? And then we'll read together the text of Revelation 17. There were copies on the chair. And after that, I will talk about the two scholarly conversations that my book engages, where I'm in conversation with. And last, I will end with my contribution to scholarship. Does that sound okay?
Yeah.
Well, that's all I prepared, so I hope that's good. So those of you who already have the book, I will be reading from certain sections of the book, so I'll give you the page numbers if you want to read along. The title of the book, The Woman, Babylon, and the Marks of Empire. Reading Revelation with a post-colonial womanist hermeneutics of ambivalence. What does that mean? Well, the woman Babylon, that is my text, the subject of my book. The marks of empire refer to two different types of marks, physical and theoretical. On one side, I'm talking about the marks of victims of empire, such as if you're thinking about American slave trade, I'm talking about lynching, or even today, those who do not benefit from empire, those who are the working poor, things of that nature. The other side of it are those who benefit from empire, those who have access or excess, if you know what I mean. So those are the two types of marks of empire. Reading Revelation, well, that's just what I do. And then post-colonial is a fancy word for just referring to empire or colonization. In other words, when a group or a country takes over another place or an individual and forces their own beliefs, religion, or way of thinking on that individual. That's what I mean by post-colonial. Womanist is another term that was created by African American women to create a space of their own. Now, African American women, they supported and agreed with black theologians, black male theologians in their work, but they felt like they had to keep their feminine gender at bay. It was being overlooked. The same thing with white feminism. They agreed and supported their efforts as well, but they felt as though their race was taking a back step. So that's why they came up with the word womanist, so that they can maintain both their race and their gender and classes they are at it, all at the same time, to remain whole. Hermeneutics is a fancy way of saying the way I read the Bible, interpretation. And ambivalence, that is a cool word, because I made it up. I'm going to break this word down in a few minutes, but it is a word that I combined from two different words to create my own. I read over this script so many times that I'm memorizing it, so now I'm like, okay, what did I not say? So basically, this wordy title says that I talk about the woman Babylon, how there are different types of empire affecting people in the book of Revelation and contemporary life, while thinking about the experiences of African American women all at the same time. How are we doing so far? Okay, so why this text? Why Revelation? When people hear that one of my research interests or my first book is on Revelation, I get a lot of different responses. And I'll tell you a couple of them. They go, oh, why? Really? No. Wow. Okay. And then I love that book, which is very rare. So why all the hoopla about Revelation, especially the woman Babylon? And this is where we'll read the text, and hopefully some of the things will pop out at you. So you have the handout for Revelation chapter 17, verses 1 to 6 and 15 to 18. Then one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls came and said to me, come, I will show you the judgment of the great whore who is seated on many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and with the wine of whose fornication the inhabitants of the earth have become drunk. So he carried me away in the spirit into a wilderness. And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and the impurities of her fornication. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of whores and of earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. When I saw her, I was greatly amazed. And he said to me, the waters that you saw where the whore is seated are peoples and multitudes and nations and languages. And the 10 horns that you saw, they and the beast will hate the whore. They will make her desolate and naked. They will devour her flesh and burn her up with fire. For God has put it into their hearts to carry out his purpose by agreeing to give their kingdom to the beast until the words of God will be fulfilled. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. There is a lot in this text, from gender issues, physical and sexual abuse, hatred, prestige, drunkenness, eroticism, etc. Babylon is adorned and described as both a woman and described as a city, a great imperial city. When I read this text, I approach it like biblical scholar Tina Pippin, and I'm reading from page 128. Following the approach of Tina Pippin, my reading strategy can be described as one of imaginative readerly engagement. Reading Revelation, as Pippin writes, involves entering into the fictional world as a participatory reader. I want to feel and see and hear and touch my way through the narrative. This experience is cathartic, involving the emotional release of anger and grief and guilt and joy in the midst of crisis. Entering into the fictional world of the apocalypse or Revelation involves facing fear and a whole range of emotions. And this is exactly what happened to me as I engaged the woman Babylon's narrative. An unexpected rise of emotions, a whole range of them welled up within me. I rejoiced with the completion of her demise, representing empire with its domineering tactics, oppressive ideology, and inclination toward excess. I know who she is, what she has done, and of what she is capable. She deserves what she gets. I was sympathetic and sad, denoting a female slave violently abused and regarded as utterly dispensable. I also know her story, and I empathize with her plight. I was fearful. I know the negative connotations associated with her name, Babylon, and yet traces of all that she represents are recognizable in me. It is a revelation that still haunts me. I will speak more about her description in a little while, but for now I want to talk about the 2 conversations that I engage in my work. I will say that as an aside, I do provide detailed information about the history of Revelation, such as the social context, authorship, all of that, in the book as well. So now on to the 2 scholarly conversations. When writing an academic book, you first have to prove that you know what's already been said before you decide to put in your little 2 cents. So, the practice is done time and time again, and oftentimes it is done in a humiliating, you were wrong, I know you taught me, but now I'm better than you kind of way. And I cannot stand this. I'm reading on page 73. My analysis pertaining to the woman Babylon did not develop out of nothing. It was not a matter of immaculate scholastic conception. Rather, what I have constructed has its foundations in 2 scholarly conversations from which I learned a great deal and whose participants I greatly respect and admire. It is important to note this because too often the advancement of scholarship seems to be accomplished at another academic's expense. The very scholars by whom we are trained, on whose learned shoulders we stand to gain knowledge, we cut off at the erudite knees with a bladed critique. This is not what I set out to do. Skipping down, while my work extends and may go in a different direction than the scholarship included in this section, my aim is not to discount, disregard, or decrease the impact that it has had in Revelation scholarship, but rather to further the conversation, inspiring others in the process. The two scholarly conversations that I engage are feminist interpretations of Babylon specifically, and also African American interpretations of Revelation in general. The first, any interpretation that's specifically on the woman Babylon is referred to as the Great Poor Debate. Now, there are many, many people who have written, male and female, about this character. But the two most prominent people are Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza and Tina Pippin. And I highlight their work specifically because they too most remarkably highlight both of the opposing sides of the debate. Still with me? Okay. Well, Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, let me first say that both of these scholars understand John, the Revelator, using the figure of the woman Babylon to represent the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire is going down. They both agree on that. Okay? Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza, on her side of the debate, asserts that while this text can and has been used in harmful ways, readers need to be aware that the figure Babylon is conventional or normal language used to symbolize a city. On page 79, I'm quoting her, she says, John uses the image of woman to symbolize the present murderous reality of the imperial world power. It must not be overlooked, however, that such female imagery for cities utilizes conventional language because then, as today, cities and countries were grammatically construed as feminine. The female imagery in Revelation, therefore, would be completely misconstrued if it were understood as referring to the actual behavior of individual women. Now, on the other side of the debate, Tina Pippin, who is the first female scholar or biblical scholar at all, to focus and do a detailed study on the woman Babylon's text, specifically Revelation 17. And she understands that feminine language has been traditionally used to describe cities. But that does not mean that they are not problematic. Pippin does a gender-critical analysis of the text. That means she focuses on the feminine gender of the character, Babylon, and examines the way in which John destroys her body to prove a point. Why did John have to use a woman's body? Didn't John know that women already have issues with the way violence is perpetuated in society? Does he even care? This is just the tip of the iceberg of the questions that Pippin deals with in her work, and all of which leads her to say that the text is misogynistic. In other words, it shows hatred and violence towards women. Well, which is it? And I'm reading from page 91. Should the figure Babylon be interpreted as a city, or should she be interpreted as a woman? Pippin helps to set up my response to these questions. Pippin writes, having studied the evils of Roman imperial policies in the colonies, I find the violent destruction of Babylon very cathartic. End quote. Even as I reflect upon the harsh conditions and realities of my ancestors during the time of American slavery, I cannot help but applaud such a detailed and colorful reversal of colonial oppression. Yet Pippin could not and did not end her analysis there. She writes, but when I looked into the face of Babylon, I saw a woman. End quote. Therein lies the tension between the depiction of the woman Babylon as an empress imperial city and as a woman. Okay. Now, the other part of the conversation that I engage is African American interpretation. Wait, I think I'm forgetting something. One more second. 91 and 100 from. Yes, I wanted to say that instead of choosing sides of this debate, I come in the middle. Because of my social, cultural heritage of having the history of African American slavery, part of my past or my ancestors' past, as well as my participation in empire, which I'll discuss later, causes me not to choose between city or woman, but both and. So I'm riding the fence. The other conversation is from African American scholars who interpret Revelation in general. None of them focus on the woman Babylon specifically. But can you guess how many biblically trained African American scholars have written on Revelation? Guess.
90%.
90% of the African American scholars? Okay. 0, 1, 4. By the time I published this book, there were only 4 Black trained biblical scholars who have written anything, whether it's a monograph or an article, on Revelation. Alan Dwight Callahan, Thomas B. Slater, Brian K. Blunt, and the only woman, Clarice J. Martin. And I summarized their works in this book as well. I'm reading page 93. African American biblical scholars have engaged Revelation scholarship with questions about how the text has been and may be interpreted by African Americans and its implications for this community. It is important that I engage this conversation, not simply because as an African American biblical scholar, I too am interested and invested in how Revelation has been interpreted by Blacks and the implications thereof, but also because my work adds a new perspective that takes on the conversation in a different direction. The overall narrative of African American biblical interpretations of Revelation reads in unison. However, I'm about to strike a different chord. Hopefully, with the addition of my work, we can begin to harmonize. After surveying each of their 4 works, I conclude that each of these Black scholars, in one way or another, argue that John of Revelation wrote from the side of the oppressed. They assert that Revelation is a minority report that gives voice to the voiceless and the marginalized in an attempt to fight against empire, oppression, the oppressive systems that they were under. In this case, the Roman Empire in Revelation. Now, I agree that John may be writing from the side of the oppressed. He definitely is set out to destroy the Roman Empire. Nevertheless, the manner in which John illustrates his destruction of this empire through the annihilation of the woman Babylon, notice I didn't call her a whore, woman Babylon's body, makes it quite difficult to suggest anything else. It's not simply a minority report. It is, in fact, a masculinist minority report. It does not have the interests of women in mind at all. This text is not a minority report in an all-inclusive sense, but is exclusively for men who suffer under oppression. Now, a post-colonial womanist approach, again thinking about empire and keeping the experiences of Black women at the front, helps me to come to this conclusion. So now, we talked about womanist, or at least I did, about womanist and how it was the process of creating a space where they can remain whole. Now, the power of naming is also very important in womanist thought and theology, which is why I decided to create my own name for my approach. Hermeneutics of ambivalence. This is the name of my contribution to scholarship, the creation of a new way to read the biblical text. So how did I come up with this word? I thought of the 2 parts of my interpretive lens, post-colonial or empire, and womanist, right? And I also thought about what I felt when I read the woman Babylon's text. I wanted to give her both a hug and slap her across the face all at the same time. Well, the 2 words that I combined are Ambivalence by Homi K. Bhabha and Veil by W.E.B. Du Bois. African-American intellectual Du Bois talks about and defines the word veil in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, which is a compilation of 14 essays when he describes the nature of racial identity in America. Du Bois's metaphor of the veil illustrates his notion of double consciousness, which causes blacks to see themselves through the eyes of white America. Du Bois argues that this veil is forced upon blacks. They are made to perceive themselves through the eyes of white America, and therefore, at times are prevented from coming into their full potential. Now, Toni Morrison, American novelist, extends Du Bois' meaning. And she said, well, yeah, that sounds all good and dandy, but this veil is also personally positioned. She gives an example of the autobiographical narratives by slaves in the 18th and 19th centuries who conveniently left out some of the harsh details from their slave narratives because who were the ones buying the text? The very ones who were in a position to actually do something about it. So sometimes the veil is put on by the individual. And lastly, Du Bois asserts that the only way for blacks to come into the fullness of themselves is to rend the veil, to remove the lens that causes them to view themselves through the eyes of white America. So what about ambivalence? Homi K. Bhabha is a post-colonial, empire, all of that theorist. And he describes ambivalence in his book, The Location of Culture. He describes it as the simultaneous attraction and repulsion within a single individual toward colonizing power. In other words, a person struggles within themselves from liking and disliking the person in control, the person in power, all at the same time. Thinking about the creation of space by black women, I decided to be creative with this word. I combined the two words together and placed Du Bois's word veil right in the center of Bhabha's term ambivalence. And I'm reading from page 56. Although derived from terminology posited by men, Homi K. Bhabha and W.E.B. Du Bois, it is deeply rooted in a womanist framework, my way of reading that is. With the insertion of one term into the other, ambivalence, I understand myself to be creatively interrupting the discourse of these men with each other, thereby creating and claiming a discursive space for women. In the midst of this literary pause, the voices of women begin to be heard, and they will. Okay, Dr. Smith, that's nice and all, but when are you going to get to the part when you actually tell us what reading the Woman Babylon's text this way did to you? Can y'all calm down just a little bit? Now, if you allow me to answer those questions, I'll read a couple of texts, but I won't call out the page numbers because I'm flipping back and forth. This is what this text has done to me. The woman of Revelation 17 is no ordinary woman. She appears to live the good life. We find her exhibiting royalty. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup. Even John himself is amazed by her. Dressed by John, she represents Roman imperial power that will be destroyed and overtaken by God's empire. However, this is not what makes her exceptional. She is marked on her forehead with an inscription that states, Babylon, the great mother of whores and of earth's abominations. Although markings on the body, such as tattoos and branding, was commonplace in antiquity, in the case of the woman Babylon, the mark of ownership on her forehead is linked to the profession of prostitution, details that are consistent with her identification as a brothel slave. Now, the Greek word for whore is porne, but it also equates to brothel slave, unlike what most scholars refer to it as a courtesan, which has more freedom than a brothel slave. And that's how I connected to African American slavery. Because of my particular cultural context, the description of the woman Babylon, particularly the punitive tattoo on her forehead, resonates racially with me. It is my historical and contemporary experience as an African American that compels me to maintain race as an analytical category along with the discussion of empire. John's detailed and vivid destruction of the woman Babylon includes humiliation via the exposure of her naked body, the feasting on her flesh while she still has breath, and the burning up of whatever of her remains. John's carefully crafted description screams, look at her. I find it really difficult to read this text and remain unaffected by the feminine gender devastation. It is hard for me to defer such imagery and remember that she is but a city. She has the same anatomical makeup as I do. She would have felt the contempt and disgust emanating from those who once were her loyal companions. She, with closed eyes or her head turned away, would have felt the lingering gaze on her naked body, wondering how many are mentally raping her as they stare. She would have felt the agonizing pain. Are y'all with me? She would have felt the agonizing pain as her flesh was being ripped from her body, to be consumed as if she had a sign on her that said, "This is my body, take, eat all of it." I wonder if they will remember her. I can imagine that she would have felt these things because as a woman reading her text, I did. And I abhor John for writing it. I can unequivocally say that this text has negative implications for real women. Babylon functions as what Clarice Martin calls an unclouded mirror that reflects the conflicting characteristics within myself and causes the veil that masks my own ambivalent or two-sided characterization to be exposed. I come face to face with an image of myself when I encounter the woman Babylon's text. I get glimpses of myself in her ambivalent identification as representing both imperial power as well as a victim of oppression. She is therefore more than just a metaphor, more than just a conventional code word for a city, because she reflects an image of me. So what am I to do with her? The woman Babylon, on one side of the veil that I talked about with Du Bois, is her being a victim of empire, or me being a victim of empire. The woman Babylon, via her forehead inscription and labeling as a brothel slave, calls to mind the oppression from slavery that my ancestors endured, including my great-great-grandmother, Indiana Grant, who was a former slave, 1851 to 1956. That's her birth and death date. And the sexual violence that women continue to experience today. Although slavery is said not to exist anymore, the crippling effects of it remain. What I talked about earlier is a reference to Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which explains how racial discrimination experienced in the Jim Crow era still exists today, although in new ways. The criminal justice system's labeling of people of color as criminals has become a more implicit, more sneaky, and thus more dangerous way to continue the same form of racial injustice. Reading the woman Babylon's text includes a reading of myself and the pain and trauma associated with my existence, and I sympathize with her. The manner in which she is horridly used, abused, and killed captures and reflects the historical Black experience of American slavery. The negative connotations associated with her name that continue to survive reminds me of the racist underpinnings of imperial ideology or racist thinking that remain in effect today. However, that is only one side of the veil of the woman Babylon and myself. As a privileged African-American woman, I also resonate with what lies on the other side of the woman Babylon's veil, her association with and participation in empire. The woman Babylon's association with imperial power as suggested by her regal attire and accessories, calls to mind my participation in, quote, the city. That is the socio-economic metropolis that is America. As a privileged Black woman, not only do I have individual educational privilege, but I also benefit from other structural privileges, such as home ownership, safety, healthcare, wealth accumulation, private transportation, access to luxury goods and services, to name a few. The economic accessibility of the woman Babylon highlights my association with empire, and I am distressed about it. Thinking about John's message in Revelation, that is his directive to withdraw from empire and align oneself with God's empire, I wonder if I have crossed over to the dark side. It is confusing and unsettling to wonder if my participation in empire, that is, my access to or use of all that America has to offer, is perceived as accommodating to imperial culture, or simply an indication that I worked my tail off. It's in here. And am now reaping the benefits of my hard labor and of those who came before me. This side of the veil, which reflects my participation in the American economy, is much more difficult to discuss than the other side of the veil that is marked by my victimization in the same structure. Indeed, it is much easier to posit a positive image of the self in terms of being free of guilt and shame or blame than to present oneself as one who is aligned with or who benefits from a potentially oppressive system. And yet, both sides of the veil make up the reality of who I am. So now what? Now that I've come to the full reality and of my duality, my two-ness, my victimization and participation in empire, what am I supposed to do? And this is my message to anyone who reads the book or hear me talk. If you find yourself straddling that line, what do? It doesn't render you neutral. It doesn't make you paralyzed. Hopefully, it would force you to act. I must rend the veil that separates both sides so that I can come into a fullness of all that I am and to have more self-love about it. Most importantly, I need to be moved to action, to do something about it. And I will conclude with this final reading on page 173. An understanding of how it feels to be oppressed helps me to frame the right questions and determine the appropriate conversations that I then take with me when I go to places or meet people, I'm paraphrasing, who can bring about change. My duality, if I welcome it wholeheartedly, can help to achieve a greater standing for the oppressed. In my profession as a New Testament professor and as an ordained minister, I help prepare leaders for ministry in today's multi-faith world. My students are within my reach, but the many lives I will touch through them are far-reaching. Thus, I remain dedicated to enhancing the status of women, both in the profession and in local communities, mentoring students by helping them to recognize, embrace, and capitalize on their potential, right, Ellen? To evoke change, publish works such as this that will not only further New Testament scholarship, but also incite within others the need for self-reflection, love of the self, and a desire to act on the behalf of others, especially those who are suffering. Rending the veil is personal, but its effects are communal. Approaching the text of the woman Babylon has initiated this process of self-realization. To my surprise, what began as a comprehensive examination of her duality, of Babylon's duality, resulted in the disclosure of mine, a revelation indeed. Thank you.
10 to 15, maybe 20 years down the road, when a doctoral student writes a dissertation on the woman Babylon in particular and the Revelation in general. I can imagine him or her categorizing or dividing the scholarship on the woman Babylon in particular as pre-Shanell T. Smith and post-Shanell. I'm not just saying that because she's our faculty. Now, it's really easy to take a side when you write a dissertation, but to stay in the liminal space and take a step forward, that is a very, very, very difficult task. And I think that's what she did. And when you take a step forward, that leads to a new path or a third way that others also will follow. And I think that's exactly what she did with this work. I'm calling it a seminal work. I think that's exactly what she did. And I'll just give an example of that's based on her title. Because a womanist dilemma is between black male theology and white feminist theology. Post-colonialism, I see it as between modernism and postmodernism. And I could go on and go on and on. And again, her way of understanding woman Babylon as a city and woman, not giving up either one. It's a very, very difficult position to maintain. It's being in a position or the space of hybridity, which is very, very difficult. But I think, again, I haven't finished reading her book, but I began to read it. I finished reading chapter 1 and so on. And I really think that this is indeed a very, very important contribution to the scholarship on women Babylon in particular and Revelation in general. And I think this is a work that all the scholars, subsequent scholars who study these things must need to take into account. So congratulations.
Thank you. I want to say that the reason why I think this book was hard to write is because there's a lot of me in it. I'm very vulnerable in this book, and I talk to some of my students and I tell them that I walk this fine line or experience this veil every day, in school and out of school. Which is why when I meet someone outside of these walls, when I don't have to be Dr. Smith, I'm Shanell. I don't lead with my profession, because if I lead with my profession in the midst of all black women, I've had the experience where it's, oh, you don't understand the struggle. Because I'm privileged, I'm uppity. But in the same token, when I say I'm Shanell again in a group of an all-white audience, then I'm not validated until I say what I've done. And even living here, when people say, oh, where do you work? Hartford Seminary. Then, okay, so who do you work for? I'm already an administrative assistant. Mm-hmm. And then when I say what I do, then it's, oh, we should talk. We should have coffee. But by that time, I'm just like, no thank you. But I walk that line, and I have to kind of hide behind my veil in order to be accepted. In order for people to give me an opportunity to know me instead of what I do or what I can do for them.
Hi, I'm John Blossom. I'm a cooperative ed student.
Hi.
I've enjoyed your talk very much. I had a comment and a question. For comments on global application, I was a member of a mission team that went to Ghana, mostly African American mission team. And there's this contrast between sweeping westernization forces, including prosperity gospel that goes into that country, and at the same time seeing the African Americans being told the story of the slave trafficking at the Slave River in Elmina Castle. So that duality is being sold all over the world, and it's a story that needs to be told broadly, I think. The question is this, specific to Revelation. Assuming that the 7 horns are the 7 hills of Rome, and 10 hills are the 10 are talking about the empire's temple cult. which was a sexual cult on certain levels.
A what cult?
A sexual cult in terms of the subjugation of women in the temple. That seems to be one of the main leverage points to be able to justify the use of or Babylon for that imagery. And you may have covered it in the book. I'm at a disadvantage here. But, thinking about this from a Christian standpoint, doesn't John offer potentially through the New Jerusalem image hope for women through Christianity to be able to find purity on the other side of this dilemma?
You have just scratched the surface of what I think might be my next topic, but Tina Pippin talks about the New Jerusalem in her work, Death and Desire, right? My immediate response to you is that the New Jerusalem, I don't know if there's women going to be in it. Because John talks about the 144,000, the men who have not defiled themselves with women, and he immediately goes and talks about the New Jerusalem, and so I have tension with the whole issue of women actually being a part of the New Jerusalem because of the way John describes those 144,000. But that would take more research on if he uses a certain Greek word that might entail a different population, but from what I gather, the 145,000 would be the ones singing the chorus with the angels. And those are the ones that he specifically said have not defiled themselves with women. Now, some would say, well, that just means that they didn't have any relation with women, but it doesn't mean women won't be there. And that's an alternative argument. But I haven't come down on where I stand solidly yet. But I can see the duality that you were talking about with the sweeping westernization and also the sex trafficking. There's duality everywhere, and it's relative per person depending on what you're grappling with. Thank you. This is John, right? Thank you.
I'm just curious about maybe the spark that got ambivalence and the veil together. Was that a aha moment? Was it a slow realization? What was that process like?
Honestly, it's like a blur. I knew that I had the terms first, separately. And I did the chapter, and I think it's chapter 1 on womanist theology, womanist hermeneutics, and went through the history of where it began with proto-womanists, with Audre Lorde and all of that. And I talked about the different types of hermeneutics that womanists have. And I said, well, you know what? The ones that we have already speak to what I'm saying, but not all the way. So maybe I should just create my own. And I had already known that I was going to work with Du Bois and his notion of the veil and Baba's notion of ambivalence. So I said, if these are the two key pieces for post-colonial and womanist, even though Du Bois doesn't really focus on feminine issues, that's why it has a womanist framework, then I'll just combine that and call it my own thing. Which is praised in womanist theology anyway, because the process of naming, the power in naming, is something that's fundamental. So,
did you do a happy dance where you realized that not work?
I didn't. I really didn't. And I still haven't, because I'm just hoping that it sticks.
Oh, well.
All right. So, as we read this text, which is a sacred text, do you say no to it? Do you say yes to it? Do you say both yes and no? And if it is both yes and no, what is Christian in that response? And what is African American Christian in that response?
In saying yes and no?
If that's so.
Well, now, when you say this text, are you talking just Revelation or the whole Bible? Because we can do the whole Bible.
It's your take.
Okay. Well, I talk about it in the introduction. Renita Weems, African-American scholar, she talks about how the biblical text for African-American women, their engagement with it, is an anomaly. The very text that's used to subjugate women, to promote slavery, and to support all of those negative things is the very text that we run to when we need some type of support. So it's a give, and it's not really a give and take, it's a love and hate relationship. And I maintain that to this day. There are texts throughout the whole Bible. Don't get me talking about Paul. You know, that I'm just like, okay, I can deal with 1 Corinthians 11, but I'm not reading 1 Corinthians 14 because I'm not being silent in church. You know, so there are texts that I feel as though if it doesn't uphold my dignity or if it tries to lessen it, then that's how I make my decision. And I believe that it is Christian because I'm a Christian. You know, but I think that's relative. I think everyone has or should make a decision whether or not they're going to hold a text sacred if it does not uplift them. Now, I can also go into the whole rabbit hole of canonicity and what did the men look like when they chose these texts, because I'm sure there's more out there, but the other ones didn't make the cut, right? But that is a whole nother conversation. But for me, I choose per text whether or not this will give me joy or uplift me in my moment, or if it doesn't, then I have to leave it alone. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation this evening. I found a couple of things very interesting. As you know, I'm here working this year in globalization, theology, and human rights. And the idea that you could not have to step on other people that have been your source of information along the way, it just was very refreshing. In law, that doesn't happen very often. You are always asked to distinguish yourself in some way, and why your information is maybe the most brilliant thing on earth. So I thank you for that. And really, this was, I have heard about a number of interpretations related to empire and woman Babylon, but this really was incredibly enlightening. So I thank you for your work, particularly in reference to the veil, which I think is very relevant for women.
Thank you so much.
I know this is moving somewhere. There we go. Thank you, Susan.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. We have 2 people over here.
I just wonder what part does the veil play in your life? I've heard the saying that a child is born with veil over their eyes. What part does the veil play in your life?
Well, I've never heard of someone being born with a veil. That's new for me. But in my life, the veil is just the separation of being both a victim of empire or someone who, the working poor, someone whose parents make enough money where you can't get financial aid, but not enough to keep you in school, kind of thing. But then I also have this access to this education that other people don't have. And so depending on the environment or the situation that I'm walking into, I have to decide, well, which side am I going to show? But I don't want to do that anymore, you know. But sometimes, as I said with Toni Morrison, it's used as a means of protection. I can't show all of my cards to everyone because not everybody has my best interest at heart. So that's how the veil plays in with me. Okay. Thank you.
I just want to say thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it very much. As someone who's in the academy, I enjoyed the academic exercise of thinking about this stuff. Also, as a minister, my question is always, how do you take this and bring it forward to what the audience? In other words, can you preach this on someone?
You should. Yes. I tell all of my students that I feel I've been called to bridge the gap between the church and the academy. I'm so tired of hearing, oh, you have to dumb things down for the church, or you can't preach in the classroom. And I think I can go anyway from both sides. But I think you just have to find out where your message is most relevant for the community. If you're serving a particular type of church, you know who your parishioners are, you know what their needs are. So you can tailor the message to them. And I guess this was the question I had for all of you, because I did intentionally call this a conversation, because I wanted to know how I can give my message legs. The main message out of here is to don't let the two sides of your identity, if you have a similar situation as me, paralyze you, but mobilize you to do something, right? I wanted to turn into maybe like a motivational workshop or something where I can use Babylon to put myself on display, really, so that I can be an example for other people to follow. So I think that's what I would do in a church setting, or in a pulpit, or a Bible study, or whatever, is to use the text just like I did and say, well, what do you see yourselves in this text? And that's another reason why in the conclusion I talk about, well, the hermeneutics of ambivalence is not just for Black women. It's not just for the text of Revelation, but it's just a way of reading the text and being read by the text. If you see an aspect of yourself within the text, embrace it, whether it's good or bad, and then deal with it. But don't let it stop you from being an active participant or a contributing member of society. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.